The man accused of stealing your hard-earned tax dollars wants to be cleared of his charges. Defense attorneys for Ted DiBiase Jr. argued there's not enough evidence to convict him. However, the judge denied that motion. The former pro wrestler is accused of stealing welfare funds meant to help needy families. He faces more than a dozen charges in the state's largest embezzlement scandal. And with that motion denied, 3 on Your Side's Quentin Smith tells us where the defense and prosecution go from here.
For 17 days, prosecutors have built their case. Well, they finally rested, and now the defense is firing back. Prosecutors allege that nearly $3 million in federal welfare funds were deposited into Ted DiBiase Jr.'s bank accounts, money that was meant for the state's poorest. Prosecutors say DiBiase used those federal dollars to buy luxury items, but the defense is fighting back against those claims, saying more than $160,000 deposited into the accounts were not traced to federal funds. According to the defense, there's no way to determine which dollars in DiBiase's bank accounts were used to buy a home, boat, truck, and other purchases. The defense told the jury DiBiase earned every contract he was given. They say he worked with a creative services company to create an app for the Department of Human Services. The app was centered around combating poverty here in the state. Although the former pro wrestler spent months working on the app, it never came to fruition. Prosecutors argue this shows DiBiase never did any work to earn the contracts. According to the prosecution, DiBiase created 2 companies. They argue both are shell companies. Prosecutors say DiBiase never spent funds on operating expenses nor payroll for his employees. They accuse DiBiase of using his companies to hide fraudulent activity taking place. The prosecution believes his contracts became illegitimate the moment he did not meet the terms of the contract. The defense still has multiple witnesses to call to the stand. They'll continue putting on their case when things ramp back up Wednesday morning. Reporting from the federal courthouse in downtown Jackson, I'm Quentin Smith.